My name is Isabelle McConville, and I am a bookseller and associate producer here at Barnes& Noble. And you may already be familiar with the name Julian Brave NoiseCat, Oscar-nominated filmmaker, writer, champion powwow dancer, and now we're adding author to the list. We Survived the Night is an incredible story of family, legacy, inheritance, identity, and so much more. Julian, thank you so much for being here today.
My book is called We Survived the Night. It's a portrait of Indigenous life across Canada and the United States, beginning with a personal narrative and expanding outward from there into a continent-wide portrait of indigeneity. What might be literarily different or ambitious about it is that it's told in the style and tradition of a Coyote story, which is a traditional trickster narrative from my own people's culture.
So this book came out on October 14th, and we're recording about a week into November now. So the book's been out in the world. How does that feel? Like, how have the last few weeks been for you?
I mean, surreal. It still hasn't really fully set in that my book is actually out there in the world, and it is it's over 400 pages. The
Hmm.
audiobook is 15 hours, so I don't know how many people who have bought it have actually gotten a chance to read the whole thing yet. So it still feels very new. But it's also just the other week I got to do a book talk in my people's homelands. We have a cultural center in at Whistler. I was invited to the Whistler Writers Festival, and so I had like, about a quarter of the audience were my relatives. Some drove across the Duffy Lake Road, which is like one of the most dangerous roads in all of Western Canada to come to the talk, like
Wow.
many hours. And it just felt like, I finally feel like I'm doing what I've always wanted to do. So it feels really special for the book to be out in the world.
That leads me perfectly into my next question. I wondered if you always knew a book was going to be your next project, or did this kind of, just appear for you?
I have always been a writer first and foremost, actually. Filmmaking was more something that kind of happened to me, but
Mm.
writing was something that I dreamed about since I was a little kid, reading every Sherman Alexie book I could get my hands on and writing like my own Sherman Alexie fan fiction at the age of 12. Um, and so, it feels really special for the book to be out in the world. It's been a part of a part of my career though, wherein I did direct my documentary Sugarcane, which was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Documentary, at the same time as I wrote We Survived the Night. So they were
Mm.
very parallel twinned sort of projects. And the way that they're related is Sugarcane, the documentary is about the system that nearly wiped my people's culture and way of life off the face of the earth, whereas We Survived the Night is kind of imagining what it is to reclaim our indigeneity in a way that is true to our ancestors and our cultures and our way of life, which were nearly, wiped out by schools like St. Joseph's Mission and sugarcane and the broader history and process of colonization.
I know you said that the documentary and the book ran parallel to each other. Did one of them start first? What was really the initial spark?
The book technically started first, so I got the contract to write We Survived the Night in the winter of 2020.
Mm.
We didn't really finalize it until early 2021. And it was only a couple months after that that my co-director on Sugarcane, Emily Cassie, reached out to me about working on that documentary together. And what was really crazy is when she reached out to me, I had just signed the book contract. And so I was like, I need to think about whether I can write a book and direct a documentary at the same time. And,
Mm.
I'd never made a film of any length, like not even a TikTok. And, I also knew that my family's connection to the Indian residential schools was a very intense one. So I took like 2 weeks to think about it. And while I was thinking about it, M forged ahead and found a First Nation that was going to begin its own investigation. And that investigation was happening at St. Joseph's Mission near Williams Lake. So when I got back to her and said that I'd be open to working with her, she told me that we were going to follow an investigation happening at St. Joseph's Mission, which she did not realize when she told me that was the very same school that my family was sent to and where my father was born.
And this book covers so much ground, but also stays very focused while going forwards and backwards in time, like you said, with that trickster narrative. How did you decide on where you wanted to start the book? Did you always know you were going to start it the way that you did?
Um, in Sugarcane, the narrative builds towards um, the discovery of my father's circumstances around his birth.
Hmm.
And I knew that the book was going to come out after the film. And I kind of, rather than wanting to build to the same thing, I just kind of wanted to start with the
Mm.
fact, with the truth, which is that my father was born at an Indian residential school and found moments after his birth in a trash incinerator by the night watchman at the school. And I wanted to start with that scene because I think it gets at a lot of the themes and questions in the book. You know, what is it to live in the wake of what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada describes as a cultural genocide? What is it to survive? And what is it to reclaim our culture in the wake of, you know, the attempted annihilation of our people and our way of life? And, you know, that moment, ever since I learned about the story of my father's birth through the making of Sugarcane and the writing of We Survived the Night, it
Mm.
has really kind of been a haunting thing for me. I mean, it's a really intense story. And so I wanted to start there to, you know, just make super clear up front, like what the stakes are, that this
Yeah.
question of survival is not like some sort of philosophical thing, but it's like it's super real and corporeal.
Yeah. I think that ties in too with the title of your book. It's such a great title, We Survived the Night. I wonder if you can tell our listeners a little bit about how you picked that and what it means for you in the book.
Well, I learned that the way that my people give the morning greeting in Secwet Machchin is Chuchwinuk. And I learned that because when I was in college, I spent the summers living on the Cannon Lake Res with my family, learning our language from my cat, that's my grandmother. And now there's actually only two remaining fluent speakers on our res. It's my grandmother and her sister. So, you know, our language is not in a really good place. And every time we'd sit down for a language lesson, my cat would go fetch a coffee mug, kind of like this one,
Mm.
and on it would say Chuchwinuk, which is how I learned that Chuchwinuk was the way we gave the morning greeting in Secwepemc, kind of like good morning, except it didn't mean good morning. Instead, it literally translates to you survived the night. And ever since learning that, I've often wondered what it was for my ancestors to greet one another in the day with the simple yet profound acknowledgement that they'd made it to another morning. You know, what did that mean in the winter of 1863, for example, when two-thirds of our nation died of smallpox? What did it mean in the mornings after our children were taken away to the Indian residential schools? And also, what kind of like, you know, twisted sense of humor decided to put "You Survived the Night" on the coffee mug of an Indian residential school survivor, you know, who is one of the last remaining fluent speakers of the language that that greeting is written in. You know, I think that there's so much in that. There's poetry, there's social commentary, there's sort of a dark humor. Here's a little sugarcane Easter egg, actually. In the culminating scene of the film where I bring my dad to have a conversation with his mother about his birth that he's always wanted to have, just before we ascend the stairs into the same living room where I learned my language, I say "Chokwi no kya." If you ever rewatch it,
Yeah.
but I say "Chokwi no kya," which means, you know, you survived the night, Grandma. And not missing a beat, she goes, "Oh, don't remind me." And so I just think, you know, I think that that kind of a sensibility, that wittiness, you know, which can get at so many things at once, is something that I am trying to capture in the way that I tell stories, you know, in a way that is both contemporary, but also true to the way that my people have always told these stories.
And I think that you do that really, really well in this book. I mean, you're making me think about something that you said in the very beginning of the book. Um, you mentioned the dichotomy of the reservation, and that really jumped out at me. You say it's hard-edged and gorgeous, the kind of place where the same brother who knocked out your teeth will sprinkle dirt and tears on your grave. I like that we can have both of these things existing at the same time. And I think that that reflects really well in your book as well, with also just that line between comedy and tragedy that you walk through it. I wonder if you can tell me about writing that, if you remember writing it, and bringing that dichotomy of the reservation to the page.
We live in a culture that sort of gives people instant information, an
Hmm.
instant summary of something. The even notion that you need to read an entire thing is now being called into question. And I think that there is something really powerful about considering and sitting with something. And I'm just really grateful to everybody who, opens up the book, who listens to the audiobook, who sits with my story and the story of indigenous peoples across this continent that I've chosen to tell because I think that it gets at things that are bigger even sometimes than indigeneity. I think that it gets at important parts of what it is to live in North America beyond just indigenous life. And I
Hmm.
think it also can get at, sort of universal questions that are of interest to all of us, relationships to parents, between fathers and sons, our relationship to our culture, our land, our traditions, how we make meaning and connection in a world where those things feel increasingly imperiled. Um, and I would just point out that it's very rare for Native people to be seen as examples of the universal. We are often seen as sort of the antithesis of that.
And that's really, really honestly just wild to think about because your book too has such a universality to it, I would say that I truly I have that in my notes here that it really has such a universality. I mean, you're telling your story and your people's story and you're covering these very specific topics, but we all, like do you have a line where you say we all have an uncle who tells a bad joke or aunties who point with their mouths. And that made me laugh because yeah, I've got those. And I think that that's what's really beautiful, like you said about, sharing in this art form. We're all human, we can all come back to this and find a little bit of ourselves in it too, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, I guess I'm just painfully aware of the reality of Native stuff in this culture.
Mm-hmm.
I work across two contexts, both Canada and the United States. My people are from Canada, but I was born and raised in the United States. My mom's American. She's an Irish Jewish New Yorker, and if you hear her talk, like she really sounds the part. And I just have this really intense awareness as a Native person in America that America doesn't really care about us. Unfortunately, Native people are very rarely the topic of conversation, particularly in the United States. It's a little bit better in Canada. When I was in Canada on the book tour, I was in a green room at a cable TV station. And the other guy in the green room who was there to do his little bit was actually a native filmmaker. And, it would be really unusual. Maybe it's never happened before for two native artists to be in a green room for a cable TV show. That doesn't happen in the US, but it does happen a bit in Canada. And in the US, we rarely, if ever, get to be the story of the day. I mean, the last time that Native people were, made international news was probably when the 215 potential unmarked graves of children were found at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which is another school that my family was sent to.
Hmm.
And so, I think it's really important for the stories that we tell to, um, have a artistic and literary quality that is of interest to people, and also to get at questions beyond, ourselves. And so I try to do that in my work because, I think that native life is fascinating. I think that it gets at many interesting questions relevant to people beyond ourselves.
Hmm.
And I just it's hard not to take it personally when your people are told over and over again that you don't matter.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to talk too about Coyote because he's such a great big part of this book. He's right here on the cover, which is
Yeah,
such a gorgeous cover, by the way.
thank you.
Yes, thank you. Um, So you weave in stories of Coyote, the trickster ancestor of your people. Can you please tell me about deciding to include those stories in the narrative and how you knew that's how you wanted to tell this story?
To write We Survived the Night, I made a probably pretty unusual decision for a 28-year-old who at the time had been living on the East Coast for a decade. And that was to move in with my dad,
Hmm.
who had left my mom and I when I was 6 years old, who I hadn't lived with for the 22 years at that point since, and who still owed me the money that I loaned him to come to my own high school graduation, just to give you like a sense for the history that I'm talking about here.
Mm,
And suddenly we were living across the hallway from each other. My dad would be out in the studio making his art every day while I was, hunched over my laptop, writing We Survived the Night and directing Sugarcane. And just as an aside, like I'll just say that like I'm very envious of the creative practices of visual artists because it seems
hmm
way more fun and joyful than than writing as a process. Like when my dad is out there carving, like he's leaned over a log, adzing, he's jamming out to Led Zeppelin, he's like taking rips from the bong in between. Like it looks like a music video out there. Whereas when I'm writing, I'm like hunched over my little laptop, horrible posture. Nobody can talk to me because if they do, I'll break my concentration. Like I'm like no fun. Um, but while I was working on the book, I had this notion that I would look into my own people's oral histories as like a source of ornamentation on the text or like small inspiration. It was a very small idea at first. And I'd only ever heard a coyote story told once in my life by a member of my family, and it was by like an uncle who was like one of my grandfather's many stray kids, essentially. And he's gone now. And so the coyote stories, are very much a tradition that is at once an enormous tradition across Indian country. I mean, indigenous peoples told coyote stories all the way from Central America to Western Canada. And at the same time, it's an imperiled tradition, at least among my people. I mean, we don't really tell these stories anymore. And
mm,
that meant that I was encountering the coyote stories in like 100-year-old anthropological texts that I was finding as PDFs on the internet, you like on JSTOR and stuff like that. And in the JSTOR articles, I was reading about, my trickster forefather, this great creator and destroyer, abandoning deadbeat dad Coyote. And then I'd be looking over here at the PDF, and then I'd be looking across the hallway at my dad, this great creator, destroyer, trickster, abandoning father, deadbeat dad, and back at the PDF, and back at my dad, and back at the PDF, and back at my dad. And all of a sudden it kind of just like clicked for me. I was like, oh my God, my father is the trickster coyote. And that insight, really fundamentally transformed the text. It led me to ask a question that I had never seen asked of narrative nonfiction before, which was, would it be possible to write an entire narrative nonfiction book in the style and tradition of a coyote story, wherein one of the major threads is a trickster narrative, which my own people have always considered to be nonfiction, a tradition that I think still gets at a lot of the truth of indigenous life, our land, our world, the world beyond that. And it was a idea that kind of grabbed me and then transformed the whole project. And I would say that, part of how I started to think about it also was like, if you are a storyteller from my people, my culture, you kind of have to, the coyote stories are like the greatest hits, those are the classics. Like you kind of have to touch on them. You have to have your own rendition of them if you are going to consider yourself a
mm.
practitioner of our tradition, of our art form. And so this is my this is my take on the coyote tradition.
Do you have a favorite story that you read in your research?
Do I have a favorite? I mean, I really love all of them. The book is organized around three of the big coyote stories. The
Mhm,
first one is called Coyote and His Son,
mhm,
which is basically exactly what it's titled. It's about Coyote, who's this lonely bachelor, gets so lonely that he tries to make himself a son, and he tries and fails a bunch of times. He makes a stone boy, for example, and the stone boy drowns in the river. He makes uh,
Hmm.
a boy out of pitch, sap basically, and he melts in the sun. And then eventually he carves himself a son out of cottonwood bark. And then they go on this epic adventure. And then Coyote gets jealous of his son, and so then he plays a trick on him, as Coyote does, and sends him up basically a tree up into the sky world, kind of like Jack and the Giant Beanstalk.
Hmm.
And while he's up there, he steals his nice jacket and also his wife. And when Coyote's son is up in the sky world, in our language, his name translates essentially to stump because he's
Hmm.
crafted from wood. Um, and up in the sky world, he discovers that he has these parents, or his grandparents, Sky Woman and Spider. Sky Woman's a weaver. Spider is married to Sky Woman because spiders are affiliated with weaving in our tradition. And they give him all these teachings and make him realize that he has, even up in the sky world, all these relatives, and then they send him home. Um, when he gets back home, he then plays a trick on his dad Coyote and sends him rushing down a river, which then leads into the next big Coyote story, which is about Coyote liberating the salmon from these two witches who are catching and hoarding all the fish at the beginning of time for themselves. And
Hmm.
Coyote tricks them into letting him into their family, into their household, and then breaks their fish trap and leads all the salmon up the river, which is a very consequential thing in the creation of our world because
Hmm.
our people used to get about half of our calories from salmon. But of course, Coyote's a trickster, and so he uses the fish to try to marry into every single village along the river that'll have him because, he's a bit of a womanizer and he's not above using, you know, his altruism to his own advantage, I guess. And what's really
Hmm.
interesting about that story is that the place where we situate the fish dam in the Secwepemc version of it is the exact same place that experts will tell you 11,000 years ago there was, in fact, a ice dam that held up a series of lakes across the mountainous interior of what is now British Columbia. And 11,000 years ago, that ice dam really did break in a yokel yap. That's the
Hmm.
Icelandic word for an ice dam flood. And
Wow.
present course of the Fraser River, and which was then populated by salmon. And so, here's my point, like this tradition correctly pinpoints the location of a major part of the end of the last ice age, a major environmental and climatic transformation in
Yeah.
North America, one that is thousands of years older than the Bible, thousands of years older than the pyramids. I think that that kind of a tradition demands to be taken seriously by
Hmm.
nonfiction, by the humanities, by the social sciences. Um, and yet it never has been. And why is that?
That right there too is one of my favorite stories in the book. Of Coyote and the two witches. Also because the way that you write them, it was making me laugh. I mean, they're a lesbian couple who find Coyote and they were really, really fun to read. They bicker, and at one point, one mentions a failed attempt at them being poly, and I just thought that was really fun. Can you tell me about writing that and kind of giving it a modern twist?
Yeah, I think, well, so firstly, I thought really hard about how I was going to interpret the Coyote stories, because
Hmm.
they are an oral tradition,
Right.
first and foremost, which means that each storyteller had a responsibility to carry forward the core values and messages in the story, but that the story itself would transform over time, and different parts would be pulled forward and pushed back, depending on the context in which the story was being told and what the storyteller felt was the important values or messages for that particular moment. I mean, that's what makes a tradition really a tradition. It's not that it stays the same
Mm.
time, it's its ability to remain relevant in the present moment. And I mean, there's a reason why Coyote's a transformer, Um, and so when I was doing my research for Coyote Steals the Salmon, which is the name of that second narrative, I noticed that in the various versions of the story that come from different places and times, there was some disagreement about the identity of the two witches. In some versions, they were sisters. In some versions, they were just witches. And still others, they were like two sandpipers, which is a kind of bird. Um,
Mm.
And so I was reading that and I was like, well, there's some debate among my ancestors about the true identity of these supernatural monopolists, and maybe fair game to update the story for present times, and throw in then a little bit of wordplay in English because our people love wordplay. So I named them which one and which two, which gives you an opportunity to do some fun wordplay with, which one is which one, which is something I do. And yeah, that all felt to me in, I mean, this is a hard thing to judge because it's so subjective and it requires you to really um, be so like deep in these stories to kind of understand the style and the spirit of them. But what felt most important to me was, keeping the core messages like don't catch all the fish. That's one of the most basic messages in that story.
Mhm.
Uh, we're all related also is another one. We're all related through Coyote and the river, and change happens through things that are both altruistic and self-serving. That's another
Mhm.
message. Um, and yet, like, what also feels important is that this tradition lives again, which means that it feels only right to me that, we update it sometimes so that it makes sense in our very complicated and confusing present.
And I'm so glad that you did that. It was a really, really great part of the book. I have to ask you about the photographs that you include in the book. Can you tell me a little bit about picking them and knowing that you wanted to share them with the readers?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that when I pick up a book and there's a photo insert, I often flip right to the photo insert
Yeah,
to try to get a sense for
I
what
did
is the
that.
book. Yeah. And Sugarcane is a visual story.
Mhm.
A film is a visual story. And I wanted the story that I was telling in text to be enlivened by the reader's encounter with all of these important figures in the text, myself, my dad, his
Mhm.
dad, my mom, Coco, all these
Mhm.
important figures, my grandmother, my great grandmother, um, and they really are sort of epic, almost mythological figures to me. That is also part of what I'm implicitly saying in the intertwining of our stories with the story of the trickster coyote is that
Yeah.
these are my mythological ancestors who I'm re-mythologizing. Our people have been mythologized in very detrimental ways
Mhm.
by outside media and culture. And so I wanted the pictures that I was selecting to really like tell the story, but also to like portray all these people in the way that I see them, which is, definitely complicated in many instances, but also as like these sort of epic characters. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, it was really fun actually to go through some of the family albums and archives and all that sort of stuff, and to figure out which uh, which images were the ones that would really tell the story in the best way. There's a lot of outtakes that I also really love.
No, really?
Mm.
Yeah. Well, the ones that you picked are really great. I like the idea of having a book that tells the story of yourself and your family and your people that's told across multiple mediums. Like we have poetry, we have photography, there's history,
Hmm.
there's so many different formats just and structures in this book. Because I think just one doesn't cut it, one doesn't really encapture just your life and your people. I like that
Hmm.
you had to use different things. Tommy Orange blurbed this book and said, Julian Brave NoiseCat has written a book I've been waiting my whole life to read. How did you feel when you first saw that?
Yeah, isn't that nice? I was over the moon about that one. Yeah, I mean, Tommy does really interesting things with structure and there in
Mhm,
particular. He has all these characters, I think about a dozen of them, who converge on a powwow, around the circle of a powwow, and then, things go awry, I guess.
mhm,
And in this book, I'm working with lots of different narrative threads, as you
mhm,
said. There's memoir, there's reportage, there's family history, there's oral history, And, I wanted to put the kinds of truths of each of those in conversation with one another, to juxtapose them, to have them parallel and build off one another. And I really think about the text in a sense as a woven narrative, which is a very
Hmm.
purposeful metaphor. I use it a bit in the introduction. And, I use that metaphor because for my people, weaving is considered the sort of highest art form. My great grandmother was a weaver. Her mother was a weaver. And like, no offense to my dad, who's a carver and who has work in the Smithsonian, but like, actually in our family, the most prized possessions are my great grandmother and great great grandmother's baskets. And so I think about the narrative, which weaves together these different narrative threads as a
Hmm.
woven basket. And then the poems that you brought up,
Hmm.
they're all, each one is named after the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, the 4 days and 4 nights of my fast, which is a ceremony that I completed during the writing of the book. For 4 years, I would go without food and water for 4 days and 4 nights, which is a really long time without water.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
and
about pushing the limit, actually.
it is, yeah. I mean, if you Google it right now, WebMD will tell you that a human body can only go 3 days, which apparently, another example of Indians knowing better. But part of the reading that I also wanted to invite in the book was, our understanding is that when you are in your fast, you are in the spirit world. And I wanted to invite the reading that, the narrative or some parts of the narrative are not necessarily all happening in the physical realm, that this is
Mhm.
a nonfiction book that takes seriously, the spiritual dimension of our life,
Yeah.
which is something that is usually off limits in nonfiction, which tends to be a very secular genre.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that you brought something so new and fresh and just, yeah, refreshing to it. And I'm so glad that you did that. We're a bookstore, so before I let you go, I'd love to wrap up by asking you a little bit about what you're reading now and just some of your favorite books that you'd like to share with readers who are looking for a next step.
Yeah, I got gifted a copy of Shudder, which was a National Book Award finalist book. I had it just a second ago, but it's Ramona Emerson, maybe. She's a Dene writer.
Okay.
And I'm really excited to get reading that. It was a long list for the National Book Award a few years back. I also just started Chyana Marie Sage's book, Chyana Marie Sage's book, excuse me, Soft as Bones, which is also indigenous memoir. She's doing similar things. It's actually really interesting that her and I are the same generation and writing at the same time, because she is also doing interesting things with indigenous,
Mm,
specifically Cree narrative and ceremonial forms through that text as a way to talk about her trauma and healing. And so, I'm really interested in other writers of diverse backgrounds, particularly other indigenous writers who are working with forms, whether that be
yeah.
words, structures, ideas from our own cultures, and bringing those into conversation with literature, whether that be nonfiction or fiction. And it's really cool that she and I had our books come out the same year, and are similarly working in that kind of a way. And I'm actually going to be on a panel with her in 2 days, so I'm going to meet her for the first time. So I'm really excited about that. Oh, and then one last one that I'd shout out, a true American classic that deserves to be a classic, Moby Dick by Herman Melville.
That, yeah, everyone does need to read that one. And
You
it's
should read
still,
it.
it holds up. It does still hold
Does
up.
does, and it's 600 pages too. It's just like, wow, pretty amazing. And also a book that was way ahead of its time. It
Oh, yeah.
was not celebrated until long after Melville had died.
That's one of those books where once you read it, you see other books and you see other movies and things, and you're like, oh, now I get it. Context. We need context.
And there are some indigenous characters in that book too.
Yeah,
Makes it of interest to me for other reasons.
absolutely. So those are the best three next steps. You heard it here first from Julian Brave NoiseCat. Thank you so, so much for being here, Julian. We Survived the Night is out now.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.